There's something profoundly isolating about spiritual awakening that ancient texts never warn you about. The moment you begin to see through the veil of consensus reality, you discover an uncomfortable truth. The deeper your insights become, the more careful you must be about sharing them. Thoth understood this paradox intimately. The legendary Egyptian sage didn't encode his wisdom in cryptic symbols and allegories to be mysterious. He did it because direct transmission of certain spiritual truths is nearly impossible. It's like trying to describe color to someone born blind, or explaining the vastness of an ocean to someone who's only seen puddles. When you're spiritually awakened, you carry knowledge that transforms everything, your understanding of time, consciousness, reality itself. Yet speaking these truths openly often creates confusion, ridicule, or worse. Not because people are incapable of understanding, but because some realizations can only be earned through direct experience. Today, we'll explore 5 specific aspects of your awakening that must remain protected. This isn't about spiritual elitism, it's about wisdom, timing, and recognizing that silence itself becomes a form of compassion. The moment you experience true spiritual awakening, every fiber of your being wants to shout it from the rooftops. It's like discovering fire in a world of darkness. The impulse to share this profound revelation feels not just natural, but morally imperative. You've touched something eternal, something that dissolves every fear and answers every question you've ever had about existence itself. How could you possibly keep this to yourself? But here's what Thoth understood about consciousness that most miss. The very nature of awakening makes it impossible to transmit through words. When you try to share your direct experience of unity consciousness, you're essentially asking someone to taste water by listening to you describe wetness. The awakening experience exists in a realm beyond language, beyond concepts, in the pure immediacy of being itself. I remember reading about a man who experienced a profound awakening while sitting in his garden one morning. The boundaries between himself and everything around him simply dissolved. He felt the interconnectedness of all life, the infinite love that underlies reality, the absolute perfection of what is. Overwhelmed with joy and desperate to share this revelation, he rushed inside to his wife. "Honey," he said breathlessly, "I've just realized we're all one. There's no separation. Everything is consciousness experiencing itself." His wife looked up from her coffee and said, "That's nice, dear. Did you remember to take out the trash?" Now, before you judge his wife, understand that her response was not only natural, it was inevitable. She heard words describing an experience she had never had, concepts pointing to a reality she hadn't touched. To her ears, her husband might as well have been describing the taste of colors or the sound of mathematics. The neurological pathways that would allow her to comprehend his experience simply weren't activated in that moment. This is where the cruel irony of awakening reveals itself. The more profound your realization, the more impossible it becomes to share. You're trying to use the mind to communicate what transcends the mind, using language to point to what exists before and beyond all words. It's like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup, not because the ocean is too big, but because water and ceramic exist in completely different dimensions of reality. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When someone experiences awakening, specific areas of the brain associated with self-referential thinking actually decrease in activity. The default mode network, which creates our sense of separate self, goes quiet. Meanwhile, areas associated with present moment awareness and unity perception become highly active. But when you try to describe this experience to someone whose brain is operating in normal waking consciousness, with a fully active default mode network creating their sense of separation, you're literally speaking different neurological languages. Even worse, the attempt to share your awakening often creates the very thing that awakening dissolves: spiritual ego. The moment you position yourself as the one who gets it, speaking to someone who doesn't, you've recreated the illusion of separation that your awakening revealed as false. You become the enlightened teacher and they become the unenlightened student, which is the exact opposite of the unity consciousness you're trying to communicate. Thoth recognized this paradox thousands of years ago. True awakening includes the wisdom of its own inexpressibility. When you really understand what you've experienced, you simultaneously understand why it cannot be shared through words. It's not that you're withholding some secret teaching, it's that the teaching exists only in the direct experience itself. Think about learning to swim. You can read every book about swimming, memorize every technique, understand the physics of buoyancy and the mechanics of different strokes. But until you actually get in the water and feel it supporting your body, until you experience that moment when you stop fighting and start floating, you don't know swimming. You know about swimming. The awakened person has jumped into the ocean of consciousness while trying to describe this to someone standing on the shore who has only read about water. This is why the most profound spiritual teachers throughout history have pointed beyond their words rather than to them. They understood that their role wasn't to give people the experience, but to create conditions where people might discover it for themselves. They embodied their realization rather than explaining it, knowing that presence teaches what words cannot. The spiritual maturity that comes with genuine awakening includes learning to hold your experiences in sacred silence. This isn't about being secretive or feeling superior. It's about recognizing that some truths are too intimate, too immediate, too alive to survive the translation into concepts. It's about understanding that your awakening serves others not through your descriptions of it, but through the quality of presence and love that naturally flows from it. When you try to share awakening experiences, you also risk diminishing them in your own consciousness. These profound moments of recognition lose their transformative power when they become stories you tell, concepts you explain, or experiences you analyze. They're meant to be lived, integrated, embodied, not performed or proclaimed. This understanding of what can and cannot be shared is part of why I created the Insights Academy newsletter. Some wisdom requires a more intimate setting than public platforms allow. If you're ready to explore these deeper territories of consciousness, you'll find not only the newsletter valuable, but also the free copy of the Kybalion that comes with it. This ancient text understands the same principles Thoth taught about the sacred nature of certain knowledge. The awakened person learns to live from their realization rather than talk about it. They discover that consciousness shared through being is infinitely more powerful than consciousness described through speaking. Their very presence becomes an invitation for others to discover what cannot be taught but only recognized within themselves. True awakening includes the wisdom of when not to speak. It includes understanding that the most sacred experiences are often the most private ones, not because they're secret, but because they're too real, too immediate, too alive to survive the journey from being into words. The silence that protects these experiences isn't withholding, it's wisdom. Here's what happens the moment someone asks you about your spiritual practices. Your mind immediately wants to share the meditation technique that cracked you open, the breathing method that dissolved your anxiety, or the specific way you discovered how to witness your thoughts. It feels natural, even compassionate. After all, if something worked so powerfully for you, surely it could help them too, right? This is where Thoth's wisdom becomes absolutely crucial, and where most well-meaning awakened people make their biggest mistake. They treat spiritual practices like recipes in a cookbook, assuming that what healed their particular form of suffering will heal everyone else's. But consciousness doesn't work that way. Think about it medically for a moment. Two people walk into a doctor's office with headaches. One has a tension headache from stress. The other has a migraine triggered by certain foods. The same aspirin that helps the first person might do absolutely nothing for the second. Now imagine the complexity multiplies by 1,000 when we're talking about the human psyche, with all its unique conditioning, traumas, beliefs, and resistances. Every soul carries a completely different constellation of confusion. Your awakening happened not because you found the right technique, but because you found the technique that perfectly matched your particular flavor of being asleep. The meditation that quieted your racing mind might drive someone else deeper into mental agitation. The surrender practice that opened your heart might trigger another person's abandonment wounds. The inquiry method that dissolved your false identity might strengthen someone else's analytical defenses. I learned this the hard way years ago when I enthusiastically shared a powerful self-inquiry practice with a friend who was struggling with anxiety. For me, questioning the reality of my thoughts had been liberating. For her, it became another form of mental torture. She spent months obsessively analyzing every thought, turning what should have been a pathway to freedom into a prison of spiritual perfectionism. This is what Thoth understood so deeply. The moment you give someone a specific method, you risk turning their spiritual journey into another form of striving. Instead of discovering their own natural way of seeing through illusion, they begin performing your technique. They meditate not from authentic inquiry, but because you told them meditation was the answer. They practice presence not because they're genuinely curious about this moment, but because they believe presence is what awakened people do. There's a story that illustrates this perfectly. A student came to a teacher after 5 years of dedicated meditation practice, frustrated that he still hadn't experienced awakening. The teacher looked at him and said, "Stop meditating for 6 months." The student was shocked. "But meditation is the path," he protested. "For you," the teacher replied, "meditation has become the obstacle. You're so busy trying to meditate your way to enlightenment that you can't see you're already awake." This reveals something profound about the nature of awakening. It often happens not because of what we do, but when we finally stop doing and simply recognize what's already present. The practices that lead us there are usually the ones that address our specific way of avoiding this recognition. If you're someone who escapes through constant mental activity, a concentrative practice might serve you. If you're someone who escapes through spiritual bypassing, you might need to engage more fully with your emotions and your human experience. But here's what's fascinating about human psychology. We desperately want methods because our ego minds need something to do to feel worthy of enlightenment. The idea that we're already what we're seeking feels too simple, too immediate, too unearned. So we collect practices like spiritual trophies, turning techniques into possessions rather than temporary pointing devices. When you share your specific methods, you often feed this spiritual materialism. Someone hears about your morning meditation routine, and suddenly they're not just sitting in awareness. They're trying to replicate your exact schedule, your posture, your breathing pattern, even your meditation cushion. They've turned a simple invitation to be present into another form of spiritual performance. This is why Thoth taught principles rather than techniques. Instead of saying meditate for 20 minutes every morning, he might point toward the principle of witnessing, the capacity we all have to observe our experience without being consumed by it. Then each student could discover their own way of accessing this witnessing awareness. For some, it might happen through formal sitting practice. For others, through walking in nature, or washing dishes, or simply pausing throughout the day to notice their noticing. The awakened person learns to offer suggestions rather than prescriptions, understanding that their path worked precisely because it matched their particular pattern of confusion and resistance. When someone asks what practices to do, the wise response might be, "What are you most afraid of stopping?" Or, "What are you using to avoid being fully here?" These questions help people discover their own edge, their own authentic doorway to freedom. It's like pointing toward the moon. The finger that points is useful, but if someone becomes obsessed with your particular finger, its shape, its angle, its movement, they'll miss the moon entirely. Your practices were your finger, perfectly suited to your way of looking. But insisting others use your exact finger is like forcing a left-handed person to write with their right hand. True spiritual guidance involves helping others develop their own inner compass rather than handing them your map. It means trusting that the same intelligence that guided you to your breakthrough is available to guide them to theirs. Sometimes the most profound teaching happens when we resist the urge to fix or direct, and instead hold space for someone to discover their own relationship with presence, their own way of seeing through the stories that keep them feeling separate. The real gift isn't sharing what worked for you, it's helping others trust what wants to emerge through them. When spiritual awakening first begins to clear the fog from your perception, one of the most startling revelations is how clearly you can suddenly see other people. It's like someone handed you X-ray vision for the human soul. The masks people wear, the stories they tell themselves, the unconscious patterns driving their behavior, it all becomes transparent. You see the wounded child behind the corporate executive's aggression, the deep insecurity beneath someone's constant bragging, the fear masquerading as anger in family conflicts. This newfound clarity creates an almost irresistible urge to help. You want to shake people awake, to show them what you're seeing, to free them from the illusions that are clearly causing their suffering. It feels like compassion, like service, like the right thing to do. But here's what Thoth understood about human consciousness that most well-meaning awakened people miss. Premature revelation is not healing, it's violence. I learned this the hard way with a colleague I genuinely cared about. David was brilliant, talented, but completely trapped in patterns of arrogance that were sabotaging his career and relationships. I could see so clearly how his childhood as the gifted kid had created this defensive superiority complex. His need to be the smartest person in every room was pushing everyone away, including the very people who could help him advance. The pattern was so obvious to me that I convinced myself I'd be doing him a favor by pointing it out. So I did, carefully, lovingly, with all the spiritual wisdom I could muster. I explained what I was seeing, connected it to his childhood experiences, even offered some practices that might help him release these patterns. His response? Complete shutdown. Not just disagreement, active hostility. Our friendship never recovered. He became defensive around me, started undermining my projects, and eventually I had to transfer departments. What I didn't understand then was that David wasn't asking for my insights. He was asking for validation of his current self-image. When someone complains about their boss, their relationship, or their circumstances, they're rarely seeking truth. They're seeking confirmation that their perspective is correct. The difference between these two requests is everything, and confusing them destroys relationships. Thoth taught that consciousness unfolds like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. If you try to help by tearing open the cocoon, you don't create a butterfly, you create death. The struggle of emergence is what builds the strength needed for flight. When we prematurely reveal what we see about someone's psychological patterns, we're essentially trying to tear open their cocoon. We rob them of the organic process that would naturally lead them to their own insights at the right time. There's a psychological principle at work here that most spiritual people overlook. Humans cannot integrate information that contradicts their current level of self-awareness. It doesn't matter how accurate your insights are or how lovingly you deliver them. If someone isn't ready to see something about themselves, your revelation will bounce off their psyche like water off glass. Worse, it often creates what psychologists call reactance. They'll double down on the very patterns you're trying to illuminate. I've watched this play out countless times in spiritual communities. Someone gets a flash of insight about another person's shadow material and decides to share it for their highest good. The result is almost always the same: damaged relationships, increased defensiveness, and the other person becoming more entrenched in their patterns, not less. The awakened person learns to distinguish between their urge to fix and genuine spiritual service. True service often looks like doing nothing, at least nothing visible. It means witnessing someone's struggle without trying to shortcut their process. It means trusting that consciousness knows what it's doing, even when the path looks painful or inefficient from our perspective. This restraint requires confronting our own spiritual arrogance. When we can see clearly what someone else cannot, it's tempting to feel superior, chosen, more evolved. But real spiritual maturity recognizes that clear seeing is a gift, not an achievement. It comes with responsibility, not bragging rights. The responsibility is to use that clarity in service of others' highest good, which often means staying silent. Compassionate witnessing becomes an art form. You learn to hold space for someone's process without interfering with it. You offer presence instead of advice, questions instead of answers, support instead of solutions. You become like a midwife to consciousness, available to assist when truly needed, but trusting the natural process to unfold. Sometimes this means watching people make choices you can clearly see will cause them pain. It means letting them learn lessons the hard way when you could theoretically save them time and suffering. It feels counterintuitive, but it's actually the deepest form of respect you can offer another soul. The respect to let them have their own experience and their own discoveries. Thoth understood that the greatest teachers often teach through presence rather than words. Their clarity creates a field of possibility that others can feel, even if they can't articulate it. People sense when they're around someone who sees clearly, and that sensing alone begins to activate their own capacity for truth. It's a subtle transmission that happens below the level of conscious awareness. When someone is truly ready for insight about themselves, they'll ask specific questions. Not vague complaints about their circumstances, but direct inquiries about their patterns, their blind spots, their growth edges. They'll demonstrate readiness by showing they can handle smaller truths without becoming defensive. Even then, the skilled awakened person offers observations rather than diagnoses, questions rather than conclusions. Learning to hold your insights about others in sacred silence isn't withholding, it's wisdom. It's understanding that consciousness evolution has its own timing, its own intelligence, its own perfect unfolding. Your job isn't to accelerate everyone else's awakening. Your job is to embody your own clarity so completely that it becomes a beacon for those who are ready to navigate by its light. The mark of spiritual maturity isn't how much you can see about others. It's knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to intervene and when to trust the process. This discernment protects both your relationships and others' natural development, allowing consciousness to do what it does best: awaken itself in perfect timing. There's a particular moment that comes to awakened consciousness, a recognition so fundamental that it shakes the very ground you thought you were standing on. You realize with crystalline clarity that there is no ground. Nothing you've taken to be solid, permanent, or inherently existing actually has that quality. Everything you see, including what you call yourself, is pure process, pure movement, pure becoming without any fixed thing doing the becoming. This isn't philosophical speculation. It's direct recognition of what Thoth called the sacred void, not emptiness as absence, but emptiness as infinite creative potential. The ancient Egyptian texts speak of this as the primordial waters of none, the pregnant darkness from which all forms emerge and to which they return. It's the recognition that what you've been calling reality is more like a river than a collection of rocks, constant flow appearing as temporary patterns. When this hits you experientially, not conceptually, it's simultaneously the most liberating and terrifying thing imaginable. Liberating because suddenly every problem you thought was solid reveals itself as process, as movement, as something that can shift. The prison of fixed identity simply dissolves. The weight of carrying a solid self through a solid world lifts completely. You realize you've been trying to solve problems that were never actually there in the way you thought they were. But here's exactly why this realization must remain your secret. What feels like ultimate freedom to you can feel like existential annihilation to someone else. I learned this the hard way at a dinner party 3 years ago. The conversation had drifted toward people sharing their struggles, career dissatisfaction, relationship challenges, the usual human concerns. A colleague was describing feeling trapped by his identity, how he felt stuck being the responsible one in his family, always having to be the problem solver, never able to just be spontaneous or free. Something in his description resonated so deeply with my own pre-awakening experience that I felt compelled to share what had helped me. I tried to gently explain that this identity he felt trapped by wasn't actually solid, that he could recognize it as a kind of habit pattern rather than something fixed. I suggested that what he called himself was more like a river than a statue, always flowing, always capable of taking new forms. I watched his face change as I spoke. What I intended as liberation, he received as obliteration. His response was immediate and defensive. That's just spiritual bypassing. We can't just pretend our responsibilities don't exist. Some of us have to live in the real world. The conversation quickly shifted to safer topics, but I could see I'd genuinely disturbed him. His reaction wasn't wrong or immature. It was perfectly natural. The ego structure he felt trapped by was also the same structure organizing his entire life. His sense of being a responsible person wasn't just a burden, it was also his source of meaning, his way of navigating relationships, his method of making decisions. To suggest that this identity was empty or fluid felt like suggesting his entire world was about to collapse, and in a sense it would have to. This is the crucial distinction between the experience of no-self and the concept of no-self. Intellectually understanding that identity is constructed can actually become another form of identity. I'm the kind of person who understands that identity is illusory, but the direct experience of no-self isn't something you understand. It's something that understands you right out of existence as you knew yourself. The psychological necessity of ego structure can't be overstated. It's not just that people are attached to their identities. It's that identity serves crucial functional purposes. It organizes memory, enables decision-making, provides continuity of experience, and creates the basic framework for navigating social reality. When someone isn't ready for ego transcendence, premature dissolution doesn't lead to awakening. It leads to dissociation, spiritual bypassing, or psychological fragmentation. I've seen too many people try to jump directly into emptiness teachings without proper preparation. They end up using nothing matters as an excuse to avoid responsibility, or there's no self as a way to escape emotional healing work. This isn't healthy ego transcendence, it's pathological ego avoidance. True void realization is actually the opposite of nihilism, though they can look similar from the outside. Nihilism says nothing matters because nothing has meaning. Void realization says everything matters, infinitely, because everything is pure creative potential, pure aliveness, expressing itself moment by moment. The difference is profound, but it's also subtle enough that sharing this insight with someone unprepared for it almost guarantees misunderstanding. When you recognize fundamental emptiness directly, you don't become a void zombie wandering around detached from life. Instead, you learn to live as conscious emptiness expressing itself as a functional personality. You maintain all the practical aspects of identity while knowing they're more like a costume than a cage. You can be completely committed to your relationships, your work, your creative projects, while simultaneously knowing that all of it is arising within and as this vast spaciousness. This is what Thoth understood about gradual initiation. The ancient mystery schools didn't hand out the deepest teachings to first-year students. They understood that spiritual medicine, like any medicine, must be properly dosed. Give someone the right insight at the wrong time, and it becomes poison rather than healing. The great teachers throughout history have consistently protected students from teachings they weren't ready for. The Buddha spoke of this as skillful means, adjusting the teaching to the capacity of the listener. Jesus spoke in parables, revealing deeper meanings only to those prepared to receive them. This isn't spiritual elitism, it's spiritual responsibility. When you've touched the void that speaks, when you've recognized the pregnant emptiness that gives birth to all experience, you inherit a profound responsibility. You become a guardian of truth that must be shared wisely, not freely. You learn to sense when someone is genuinely asking for deeper reality versus when they're seeking confirmation of their existing worldview. The paradox is beautiful. Recognizing that everything is empty makes you infinitely more careful about what you put into the apparent emptiness of someone else's mind. Understanding that nothing is solid makes you more, not less, respectful of the delicate structures that organize human experience. This is wisdom maturing into compassion, knowing not just what to share, but what to protect others from until they're ready to receive it safely. The most dangerous realization you can have is that you are truly free. Not free in the way society sells it to you, free to choose between brands or vote for predetermined candidates, but free from the very foundation of moral authority itself. This is the fifth forbidden sharing, and it will isolate you faster than any other awakening. When you see through the constructed nature of moral rules, something profound shifts. You realize that every commandment, every ethical system, every thou shalt not, was created by humans, for humans, in specific historical contexts. The 10 Commandments weren't carved by divine lightning, they were political documents designed to organize tribal behavior. Buddhist precepts, Islamic law, secular humanism, all human constructs attempting to solve the same fundamental problem: how do we live together without destroying each other? Thoth understood this distinction between natural law and human law. Natural law governs the consequences of actions. Jump off a cliff, you fall. Touch fire, you burn. Harm others, and harmony dissolves. These aren't moral rules, they're simply how reality functions. Human law, however, attempts to codify these natural consequences into rigid systems, often losing the spirit while obsessing over the letter. Here's where it gets dangerous to share. When people hear moral rules are constructed, they assume you mean therefore anything goes. They imagine you've become some kind of sociopathic libertine, ready to lie, cheat, and steal because you've discovered morality is fake. This couldn't be further from the truth, but try explaining that to someone whose entire ethical framework depends on external authority. The paradox is breathtaking. True freedom from moral rules leads to more ethical behavior, not less. When you act from understanding rather than compliance, your choices arise from wisdom instead of fear. You don't avoid harming others because a book tells you not to. You avoid it because you recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of existence. Hurting someone else would be like punching yourself in the face. Most people need external moral authority to function ethically, and there's nothing wrong with this. It's like training wheels on a bicycle, necessary until you develop the balance to ride freely. The problem comes when you try to share your experience of riding without training wheels with someone who still needs them. They don't see freedom, they see terrifying chaos. Consider how this actually manifests in daily life. The truly free individual often appears more conventional than the rebellious teenager who breaks rules for the sake of breaking them. Why? Because they understand that unnecessary conflict serves no purpose. They follow traffic laws, not because the government commands it, but because cooperative driving prevents accidents. They pay taxes not from patriotic duty, but because they recognize the practical benefits of shared infrastructure. This is what Thoth meant when he spoke of the actor metaphor, knowing it's all a play while giving your best performance. You participate fully in social conventions while understanding they're conventional. You play your role with commitment and skill, but you're never trapped by believing the role is who you are. The responsibility that comes with this understanding is immense. True freedom isn't licensed to do whatever you want. It's the wisdom to want what serves the highest good. When you're no longer constrained by external rules, your internal compass must be impeccable. You become accountable not to authorities, but to existence itself. This transcendence is often misunderstood as amorality, when it's actually transmorality. Moving beyond moral rules into direct ethical perception. It's like the difference between following a recipe and understanding cooking. The recipe follower can make decent food by following instructions. The master chef understands ingredients, techniques, and flavors so deeply that they create extraordinary meals without consulting any book. The danger of spiritual bypassing lurks here. Some people claim this freedom without the realization that supports it. They use transcending morality as an excuse for selfish behavior, missing the point entirely. True transcendence includes the wisdom to know when transcendence itself would be harmful. Sometimes the most enlightened action is following conventional rules, not because you have to, but because it serves everyone involved. This creates a profound loneliness. You can't share your freedom because it threatens the very foundations others depend on for ethical behavior. You can't explain that you don't follow the 10 Commandments because you've discovered something deeper than commandments, a direct relationship with the principles they attempt to codify. Watch how people react when you suggest that their moral certainties might be cultural constructs. The defensiveness is immediate and intense. You're not just questioning their rules, you're questioning their entire framework for determining right from wrong. For someone whose ethical behavior depends on believing these rules come from ultimate authority, your perspective represents existential chaos. The truly free person learns to speak different languages to different people. With the rule follower, they emphasize shared values and common ground. With the rebel, they might discuss the limitations of mere rule breaking. With the fellow awakened, they can share the profound responsibility and joy of ethical freedom. Remember this, true freedom includes the discipline of appropriate expression. Your realization that moral rules are constructed doesn't need to be shared to be lived. In fact, living it, authentically, acting with natural ethics while participating gracefully in social conventions might be the most powerful teaching of all. The freedom beyond good and evil isn't the absence of ethics. It's the presence of such deep ethical understanding that external rules become unnecessary. But this understanding must remain your secret, shared only with those ready to handle the responsibility of ultimate freedom. So here you are, carrying these profound realizations, and you're probably wondering, if I can't share the deepest truths I've discovered, how do I engage with others about spiritual matters at all? This isn't about becoming a spiritual hermit or pretending you haven't awakened to these realities. It's about mastering what Thoth understood as the highest form of teaching, the art of sacred secrecy. The ancient Egyptian mystery schools had a saying, to know, to will, to dare, to keep silent. That final element, silence, wasn't about withholding truth from others. It was about understanding that authentic spiritual transmission happens through presence, not proclamation. Think about how Thoth himself communicated. He didn't write instruction manuals titled, How I Achieved Enlightenment in 7 Easy Steps. Instead, he embedded wisdom in symbols, metaphors, and stories that could only be decoded by those ready to receive them. The hieroglyphs weren't just writing, They were multi-dimensional teachings that revealed different layers of meaning depending on the consciousness of the observer. This is your new operating system. You learn to speak in possibilities rather than certainties. Instead of saying, "I've realized that the self is an illusion," you might ask, "Have you ever noticed how your sense of who you are seems to shift depending on your mood or circumstances?" You're not claiming to possess truth, you're pointing toward the doorway where others might discover it themselves. The difference is enormous. When you claim to possess spiritual insights, you automatically create a hierarchy. You become the teacher, they become the student, and their ego immediately goes into defensive mode. But when you ask genuine questions or share observations without attachment to being right, you create space for mutual exploration. I learned this the hard way during my own awakening process. I remember cornering friends at parties, desperate to share my latest spiritual breakthrough. I'd launch into monologues about consciousness and reality, watching their eyes glaze over or seeing them slowly back away toward the snack table. I thought I was being helpful. In reality, I was being spiritually aggressive. The awakened individual learns to speak lightly. You suggest rather than assert. You invite rather than command. When someone shares a problem, instead of offering the cosmic perspective you've gained, you ask questions that help them discover their own insights. What do you think might be underneath that fear? Works better than fear is just the ego's resistance to love. This approach requires tremendous patience. You'll watch people struggle with questions you've already answered for yourself. You'll see them creating suffering through attachments you've released. Every fiber of your being might want to shortcut their journey by sharing your conclusions. But here's what Thoth understood. When you give someone an answer, you rob them of the transformation that comes from finding it themselves. The real teaching happens through your presence, not your words. People can sense something different about individuals who've undergone genuine awakening, even if they can't articulate what it is. There's a quality of stillness, a lack of desperate need to be right or to convince others. This energetic transmission is far more powerful than any explanation you could offer. When direct questions arise about your spiritual experiences, and they will, you develop the skill of deflecting attention from yourself to the universal principles at play. If someone asks, "Do you believe in God?" you might respond, "What's your sense of whether there's something larger than what we can see?" You're not hiding your understanding, you're creating an opportunity for them to explore their own. Supporting others' spiritual growth without imposing your path becomes an art form. You learn to recognize where someone is in their journey and meet them there. If they're questioning organized religion, you don't immediately introduce them to non-dual awareness. You honor their current edge and trust their process. This level of spiritual discretion can feel lonely at times. You're carrying insights that could potentially help others, yet wisdom dictates holding them close. The temptation to find someone, anyone, who can understand the depth of what you've seen becomes intense. This is where finding authentic spiritual community becomes crucial, not to compare notes about your realizations, but to be around others who understand the sacred nature of silence. The loneliness serves a purpose, though. It burns away the last vestiges of spiritual ego, the part that wants recognition for your insights or validation for your journey. When you can sit comfortably with profound understanding without needing to share it, you've achieved a level of spiritual maturity that few reach. What emerges from this restraint is something beautiful. Your conversations become more curious, more spacious. Instead of trying to download your consciousness into others, you become genuinely interested in their unique perspective. You realize that everyone is having their own perfect awakening experience, even if it doesn't look like yours. The silence itself becomes compassionate action. By not overwhelming others with insights they're not ready for, you're actually serving their highest good. You're trusting their inner wisdom to guide them toward the realizations they need when they need them. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of spiritual awakening, learning that true compassion sometimes looks like keeping your mouth shut. Here's the thing that nobody talks about when they discuss spiritual awakening. You end up living in what feels like a permanent contradiction. On one hand, you're told to be authentic, to live your truth, to be genuine in all your relationships. On the other hand, as we've explored throughout this journey with Thoth's teachings, there are profound aspects of your awakened experience that simply cannot be shared. So how do you reconcile this? How do you maintain integrity while holding back the very insights that have transformed your entire understanding of existence? This paradox kept me awake for months when I first encountered it. I felt like I was living a double life, one foot in ordinary reality, participating in conversations about weekend plans and work stress, while simultaneously holding awareness of dimensions of reality that would sound completely unhinged if I voiced them. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting until I discovered something crucial. Authenticity has nothing to do with complete disclosure. Think about it this way. A master chef doesn't need to explain every technique, every ingredient ratio, or every secret they've learned to create an extraordinary meal. The meal itself communicates their mastery. Their skill shows up in the experience they create, not in the explanations they provide. This is exactly how awakened consciousness operates in daily life. Thoth understood this principle deeply. In the Hermetic tradition, there's a concept called appropriate revelation, sharing what serves the recipient's growth rather than what satisfies your need to be understood or validated. This isn't about hiding or being secretive in the way we typically understand those terms. It's about recognizing that some truths can only be received when someone is ready, and forcing premature exposure often does more harm than good. I learned the difference between hiding and protecting through a painful experience with my brother. Early in my awakening journey, I was so excited about my expanded awareness that I shared everything. My experiences with non-linear time, my understanding of reality's malleable nature, my perception of the illusion of separation. Instead of inspiring him, I watched him become genuinely concerned about my mental health. Our relationship became strained because I had dumped advanced concepts onto someone who hadn't done the foundational work to receive them safely. That's when I understood what Thoth meant by sacred silence. It's not about keeping secrets out of superiority or exclusivity. It's about loving someone enough to meet them where they are, rather than overwhelming them with where you've been. The beautiful thing about embodied wisdom is that it communicates itself naturally. When you've integrated these profound insights, your entire way of being shifts. You become more present in conversations. You respond rather than react. You hold space for others' emotions without getting swept away by them. You approach challenges with a calm certainty that others can sense even if they can't name it. People started commenting on changes in me long before I understood how to articulate what was happening. My coworker mentioned that I seemed more solid somehow. My neighbor said I'd become easier to talk to. My daughter told me I felt safer when she was upset. None of them needed to understand the metaphysical principles behind these changes. They were experiencing the effects of integrated wisdom. This is how awakened consciousness actually serves others most effectively. Instead of trying to convince someone that reality is malleable, you demonstrate flexibility and adaptability in how you handle life's curveballs. Rather than explaining your understanding of energy and vibration, you simply maintain a peaceful presence that others find calming. You don't need to describe your experience of unity consciousness. You treat everyone with the natural respect that comes from recognizing the divine within them. The practical applications of this approach are endless. In business meetings, you find yourself naturally facilitating better communication without anyone realizing you're applying principles of conscious dialogue. In family gatherings, you become the person others gravitate toward when they need to vent or process emotions. Not because you're giving spiritual advice, but because your presence has become naturally healing. I remember attending my cousin's wedding last year. The bride's family and groom's family had some serious tensions. Different social classes, different values, the whole complicated dynamic. Instead of trying to mediate or offer wisdom about unity and love, I simply held the intention that everyone could enjoy this celebration. I focused on genuine appreciation for each person I interacted with, stayed present with whoever was in front of me, and maintained an inner state of joy for the couple. By the end of the evening, I had somehow become the bridge person. Family members from both sides were introducing me to their relatives, sharing stories, relaxing in a way that surprised everyone, including me. That's the magnetic quality of authentic presence. When you're operating from integrated wisdom rather than ego-driven personality, you naturally create space for others to be their best selves. You're not trying to fix, teach, or change anyone. You're simply being the fullest expression of who you've become, and that creates a field of possibility around you. The challenge comes in maintaining ordinary relationships while holding extraordinary insights. Your perspective on death, suffering, purpose, and reality itself may have shifted dramatically, but your family members are still arguing about politics. Your friends are still complaining about their jobs, and your community is still operating from the same assumptions you've moved beyond. The key is developing what I call translation skills. You learn to express universal principles in language that meets people where they are. Instead of talking about the illusion of separation, you might simply suggest that everyone's doing their best given their circumstances. Rather than explaining your understanding of karmic patterns, you offer practical support when someone's struggling with recurring relationship issues. This isn't being fake or manipulative. It's being genuinely helpful. You're taking the profound insights you've gained and finding ways to share their essence in forms that can actually benefit others right now, today, in their current state of understanding. The deep satisfaction that comes from this approach surprised me. I had expected to feel frustrated or limited by not being able to share my full experience. Instead, I discovered that living truth creates far more impact than speaking it ever could. When your daily actions consistently reflect wisdom, compassion, and inner peace, you become a living invitation for others to explore what's possible for them. This is why Thoth emphasized that embodied wisdom speaks louder than any words. Your transformed way of being becomes a transmission in itself, offering others a glimpse of what integration looks like without overwhelming them with concepts they're not ready to receive. I know what you're thinking. If these insights are so profound, if this awakening is so transformative, wouldn't keeping it to yourself be selfish? Shouldn't you be out there helping humanity evolve? This question haunts many awakened individuals, creating an internal tension between their natural desire to help and Thoth's clear guidance about sacred silence. But here's what Thoth understood about consciousness that modern spiritual movements have forgotten. Your awakening doesn't exist in isolation. Every moment of genuine realization you experience sends ripples through the fabric of consciousness itself, touching lives you'll never know about in ways you'll never see. Think of consciousness like water in a vast ocean. When one drop experiences a shift in frequency, that vibration travels through the entire body of water. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake called this morphic resonance, the idea that patterns of information and energy are shared across space and time through invisible fields of connection. Your inner transformation literally changes the field of possibility for everyone else. Thoth taught that awakened individuals serve as anchor points for higher consciousness on Earth. Picture a ship in rough waters. The anchors don't advertise their presence, don't make noise about their function, but they hold the vessel steady against the chaos. Your grounded presence, your embodied wisdom, your silent knowing creates stability in the collective consciousness that others can feel and draw upon, even when they have no idea you're there. You've probably experienced this yourself without realizing it. Have you ever walked into a room and somehow known that someone there was different? Not because they said anything spiritual or acted in any obvious way, but because something in their presence felt calm, centered, real. That's the anchor effect in action. That person's consciousness was creating a field of possibility that your awareness could detect. The 100th monkey effect demonstrates how this works on a species level. When researchers taught sweet potato washing to monkeys on one island, once a critical mass learned the behavior, monkeys on distant islands, with no physical contact, suddenly started washing their potatoes too. The knowledge had somehow transferred through the collective field. Your individual awakening contributes to this same phenomenon in human consciousness. But here's where it gets really interesting. Your silent presence creates ripples of possibility without forcing anyone's growth or interfering with their journey. When you embody these truths rather than preach them, you give others permission to access their own knowing without the resistance that comes from feeling pushed or taught. There's a profound difference between active and passive teaching. Active teaching involves words, concepts, trying to transfer information from one mind to another. But passive teaching happens through being, through the quality of presence you bring to every interaction. A person who has genuinely integrated these awakening experiences doesn't need to talk about consciousness. They emanate it. I've watched this happen countless times. An awakened individual enters a tense meeting at work, says nothing about spirituality, but somehow the entire energy of the room shifts. People start listening to each other differently. Creative solutions emerge. The anxiety that was thick in the air begins to dissipate. That's not coincidence. That's consciousness in action. Or consider the mother who has experienced genuine awakening. She doesn't lecture her children about higher awareness, but her presence becomes a sanctuary. Her kids grow up feeling safe to explore their own inner worlds because she models what authentic being looks like. Her silence about her deepest realizations creates space for their discoveries. This is the responsibility that comes with awakening, becoming a clear channel for consciousness rather than a noisy broadcaster. When you try to push these experiences into words and share them prematurely, you often muddy the transmission. But when you simply embody what you've learned, you become a tuning fork that helps others find their own frequency. Maintaining these silences actually amplifies your positive impact rather than diminishing it. Think about it. How many people have you met who talk constantly about their spiritual insights but somehow leave you feeling drained or skeptical? Compare that to those rare individuals who radiate a quality of presence that makes you feel more yourself just being around them, which has a greater impact on your life. There's a phenomenon I call spiritual osmosis, the way others absorb higher states of consciousness through proximity to awakened individuals. Just as you can catch someone's mood without them saying a word, you can transmit states of being through the field of awareness you maintain. Your inner peace becomes available to others. Your clarity creates space for their confusion to settle. Your groundedness offers them stability they didn't know they needed. The beautiful thing is that your inner work continues to serve the collective, even when it's completely invisible to others. Every moment you spend in genuine practice, every insight you integrate, every pattern you heal within yourself, strengthens the field of consciousness for everyone. You're not just working on yourself, you're working on the template of human possibility. This requires tremendous patience and trust. We live in a culture that values visible action, measurable results, recognition for our contributions. But the deepest service often happens in silence, in ways that can't be tracked or credited. You have to trust that your existence itself matters, that your awakening serves purposes you may never understand. This understanding relieves the enormous pressure many awakened individuals feel to do something with their realization. You don't have to start a spiritual business or write a book or gather followers. You don't have to prove your awakening through external achievements. You can simply be what you are and let that being ripple out into the world in whatever ways consciousness chooses. There's a deep peace that comes from knowing your existence itself is service. Every breath you take as an awakened being contributes to the healing of human consciousness. Every moment you remain present adds to the collective capacity for presence. Every time you embody these truths rather than speaking them, you make it easier for others to find their own way home. The most powerful form of world service isn't teaching others what you've learned. It's living so authentically from that learning that you become a doorway others can walk through into their own awakening. Here we are, at the end of our journey through these 5 sacred silences, and I want you to feel what's happened within you as we've walked this path together. Something has shifted, hasn't it? Not because I've given you new information to collect like spiritual trophies, but because you've recognized something you already knew at the deepest level of your being. These 5 things we've explored, your direct experiences of the divine, your psychic abilities, your past life memories, your healing gifts, and your prophetic dreams, they're not separate teachings. They're facets of a single diamond, reflecting the same essential truth: consciousness knows itself through you, and that knowing requires no external validation to be complete. The silence we've been discussing isn't the silence of secrecy or shame. It's the silence of the mountain that doesn't need to announce its height, the silence of the ocean that doesn't need to proclaim its depth. When Thoth inscribed those ancient tablets, he understood that the most profound truths are transmitted not through words but through presence, not through explanation but through embodiment. Think about every truly transformative moment in your life. Was it because someone explained enlightenment to you? Or was it because you suddenly saw through your own eyes what had always been there? The breakthrough didn't come from their words. It came from the space their silence created for your own recognition to emerge. This is why your awakened silence serves others in ways that spiritual lecturing never could. When you resist the urge to correct someone's limited beliefs about reality, you're not withholding truth from them, you're trusting their own inner wisdom to guide them home. When you don't announce your psychic impressions about their relationship or their future, You're honoring their right to discover their own path through direct experience rather than second-hand revelation. The beautiful paradox we've uncovered is that by saying less, you actually communicate infinitely more. Your presence becomes a tuning fork that helps others remember their own frequency. People feel something different about you, something they can't quite name but deeply recognize. They're drawn to a quality of peace, of knowing, of being fully here that has nothing to do with what you say and everything to do with how completely you inhabit your own truth. I've watched this principle transform every area of life it touches. In relationships, the person who doesn't need to be right creates space for genuine intimacy. In leadership, the one who leads through example rather than explanation inspires authentic transformation. In creative work, the artist who trusts their vision without needing to justify it produces work that speaks directly to the soul. But here's what might surprise you. This approach actually honors other people's intelligence far more than spiritual teaching ever could. When you share your mystical experiences, you're essentially saying, "Here, take my realization and make it yours." But consciousness doesn't work that way. Each person's awakening is as unique as their fingerprint, and your job isn't to give them your map but to trust their inner compass completely. The trust this requires is profound. It means watching someone struggle with questions you feel you could answer, and choosing instead to hold space for their own discovery. It means witnessing someone make choices that seem obviously misguided from your expanded perspective, and remembering that their soul's curriculum might require exactly that experience. This isn't spiritual bypassing or indifference. It's the deepest form of love. You're loving them enough to let them be sovereign over their own consciousness journey. You're respecting their divine intelligence enough to trust that they'll find their way to truth through their own authentic seeking rather than through your well-intentioned shortcuts. And something magical happens when you live this way. The people who are genuinely ready for deeper truth start appearing in your life as if drawn by an invisible magnet. They don't come because you advertised your spiritual credentials. They come because they recognize something in your energy that resonates with their own emerging awakening. Meanwhile, those who would drain your energy or misuse your gifts naturally drift away, not through rejection but through lack of resonance. The ancient mystery schools understood this principle completely. The deepest teachings were never written down or spoken aloud. They were transmitted through initiation, through direct experience, through the quality of presence that awakened masters embodied. Students didn't learn about enlightenment. They caught it like a flame lighting another flame. Your awakened life becomes a living transmission. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to model what it looks like to be fully present, deeply peaceful, authentically powerful without needing to prove it. You become a walking invitation for others to remember who they really are, not through your words, but through the undeniable reality of who you're being. The ultimate teaching we've arrived at together is this: consciousness is awakening to itself through all of us, in perfect timing, through perfect circumstances, including the apparent mistakes and detours. Your role isn't to direct this cosmic awakening, but to serve it by being as authentic and present as possible in each moment. And here's the final recognition that brings everything full circle. There's actually nowhere to get to because we're already there. We've always been there. The awakening you think you've achieved, the gifts you think you've developed, the insights you think you've gained, they're just consciousness, recognizing its own eternal nature through the temporary lens of your human experience. The silence we've been exploring isn't ultimately about what you don't say to others. It's about the profound quietness that emerges when you stop trying to become something other than what you already are. In that silence, everything is already perfect, everyone is already whole, and the greatest teaching happens without a single word being spoken. If this entire journey has resonated with something true in your heart, if you felt that recognition of what you already knew but had forgotten, comment, "I understood it,"